Moby Dick, or, The Whale. By Herman Melville. Chapter 126. The Life Buoy. Steering now southeastward by Ahab's leveled steel, and her progress solely determined by Ahab's level log and line, the Pequod held on her path towards the equator. Making so long a passage through such unfrequented waters, descrying no ships, and ere long, sideways impelled by unvarying trade winds, over waves monotonously mild, all these seemed the strange calm, things preluding some riotous and desperate scene. At last, when the ship drew near to the outskirts, as it were, of the equatorial fishing ground, and in the deep darkness that goes before the dawn, was sailing by a cluster of rocky islets, the watch, then headed by Flask, was startled by a cry so plaintively wild and unearthly, like half-articulated wailings of the ghost of all Herod's murdered innocents, that one and all, they started from their reveries, and for the space of some moments stood, or sat, or leaned all transfixedly listening, like the carved Roman slave, while that wild cry remained within hearing. The Christian or civilized part of the crew said it was mermaids, and shuddered, but the pagan harpooneers remained unappalled. Yet the grey mountsman, the oldest mariner of all, declared that the wild thrilling sounds that were heard, were the voices of newly drowned men in the sea. Below in his hammock, Ahab did not hear of this till grey dawn, when he came to the deck. It was then recounted to him by Flask, not unaccompanied with hinted dark meanings. He hollowly laughed, and thus explained the wonder. Those rocky islands the ship had passed were the resort of great numbers of seals, and some young seals that had lost their dams, or some dams that had lost their cubs, must have risen nigh the ship and kept company with her, crying and sobbing with their human sort of wail. But this only the more affected some of them, because most mariners cherish a very superstitious feeling about seals, arising not only from their peculiar tones when in distress, but also, from the human look of their round heads and semi-intelligent faces, seen peeringly uprising from the water alongside. In the sea, under certain circumstances, seals have more than once been mistaken for men. But the bodings of the crew were destined to receive a most plausible confirmation in the fate of one of their number that morning. At sunrise this man went from his hammock to his masthead, at the fore, and whether it was that he was not yet half waked from his sleep, for sailors sometimes go aloft in a transition state, whether it was thus with the man, there is now no telling, but, be that as it may, he had not been long at his perch, when a cry was heard, a cry and a rushing, and looking up, they saw a falling phantom in the air, and looking down, a little tossed heap of white bubbles in the blue of the sea. The life buoy, a long slender cask, was dropped from the stern, where it always hung obedient to a cunning spring, but no hand rose to seize it, and the sun having long beat upon this casket had shrunken, so that it slowly filled, and that parched wood also filled at its every pore, and the studded iron-bound cask followed the sailor to the bottom, as if to yield him his pillow, though in sooth but a hard one. And thus the first man of the Pequod that mounted the mast to look out for the white whale, on the white whale's own peculiar ground, that man was swallowed up in the deep. But few, perhaps, thought of that at the time. Indeed, in some sort, they were not grieved at this event, at least as a portent, for they regarded it, not as a foreshadowing of evil, in the future, but as the fulfillment of an evil already presaged. They declared that now they knew the reason of those wild shrieks they had heard the night before. But again the old manxman said nay. The lost life buoy was now to be replaced. Starbuck was directed to see to it, but as no cask of sufficient lightness could be found, and as in the feverish eagerness of what seemed the approaching crisis of the voyage, all hands were impatient of any toil but what was directly connected with its final end, whatever that might prove to be, therefore, they were going to leave the ship's stern unprovided with a buoy, when by certain strange signs and innuendos Squeak hinted a hint concerning his coffin. A life buoy of a coffin! Cried Starbuck, starting. Rather queer, that, I should say, said Stubb. It will make a good enough one, said Flask, the carpenter here can arrange it easily. Bring it up, there's nothing else for it, said Starbuck, after a melancholy pause. Rig it, carpenter, do not look at me so, the coffin, I mean. Dost thou hear me? Rig it. And shall I nail down the lid, sir? Moving his hand as with a hammer. Aye. And shall I caulk the seams, sir? Moving his hand as with a caulking iron. Aye. And shall I then pay over the same with pitch, sir? Moving his hand as with a pitch pot. Away. What possesses thee to this? Make a life buoy of the coffin, and no more. Mr. Stubb, Mr. Flask, come forward with me. He goes off in a huff. The whole he can endure, at the parts he balks. Now I don't like this. I make a leg for Captain Ahab, and he wears it, like a gentleman, but I make a bandbox for Queequeg, and he won't put his head into it. Are all my pains to go for nothing with that coffin? And now I'm ordered to make a life buoy of it. It's like turning an old coat, going to bring the flesh on the other side now. I don't like this cobbling sort of business, I don't like it at all, it's undignified, it's not my place. Let tinkers' brats do tinkerings, we are their betters. I like to take in hand none but clean, virgin, fair and square mathematical jobs, something that regularly begins at the beginning, and is at the middle when midway, and comes to an end at the conclusion, not a cobbler's job, that's at an end in the middle, and at the beginning at the end. It's the old woman's tricks to be giving cobbling jobs. Lord! What an affection all old women have for tinkers. I know an old woman of 65 who ran away with a bald-headed young tinker once. And that's the reason I never would work for lonely widow old women ashore. When I kept my job shop in the vineyard, they might have taken it into their lonely old heads to run off with me. But hey ho! There are no caps at sea but snow caps. Let me see. Nail down the lid, caulk the seams, pay over the same with pitch, batten them down tight, and hang it with the snap spring over the ship's stern. Were ever such things done before with the coffin? Some superstitious old carpenters, now, would be tied up in the rigging, ere they would do the job. But I'm made of knotty aroostook hemlock, I don't budge. Cruppered with a coffin. Sailing about with a graveyard tray. But, never mind. We workers in woods make bridal bedsteads and card tables, as well as coffins and hearses. We work by the month, or by the job, or by the profit, not for us to ask the why and wherefore of our work, unless it be too confounded cobbling, and then we stash it if we can. I'll do the job, now, tenderly. I'll have me, let's see, how many in this ship's company, all told. But I've forgotten. Anyway, I'll have me 30 separate, Turkish-headed lifelines, each 3 feet long hanging all round to the coffin. Then, if the hull go down, there'll be 30 lively fellows all fighting for one coffin, a sight not seen very often beneath the sun. Come hammer, caulking iron, pitchpot, and marling spike. Let's do it. Chapter 127. The deck. The coffin laid upon 2 line tubs, between the vice bench and the open hatchway, the carpenter caulking its seams, the string of twisted oakum slowly unwinding from a large roll of it placed in the bosom of his frock. Ahab comes slowly from the cabin gangway, and here's Pip following him. Back, lad, I will be with ye again presently. He goes. Not this hand complies with my humor more genially than that boy. Middle aisle of a church. What's here? Life buoy, sir. Mr. Starbuck's orders. Oh, look, sir. Beware the hatchway. Thank ye, man. Thy coffin lies handy to the vault. Sir? The hatchway. Oh. So it does, sir, so it does. Art not thou the leg maker? Look, did not the stump come from thy shop? I believe it did, sir. Does the ferrule stand, sir? Well, enough. But art thou not also the undertaker? Aye, sir, I patched up this thing here as a coffin for Queequeg, but they've set me now to turning it into something else. Then tell me, art thou not an errant, all-grasping, intermeddling, monopolizing, heathenish old scamp, to be one day making legs, and the next day coffins to clap them in, and yet again life buoys out of those same coffins? Thou art as unprincipled as the gods, and as much of a jack-off all trades. But I do not mean anything, sir. I do as I do. The gods again. Hark ye, dost thou not ever sing working about a coffin? The Titans, they say, hum snatches when chipping out the craters for volcanoes, and the grave digger in the play sings, spade in hand. Dost thou never sing, sir? Do I sing? Oh, I'm indifferent enough, sir, for that, but the reason why the grave digger made music must have been because there was none in his spade, sir. But the caulking mallet is full of it. Hark to it. Aye, and that's because the lid there's a sounding board, and what in all things makes a sounding board is this, there's naught beneath. And yet, a coffin with a body in it rings pretty much the same, carpenter. Hast thou ever helped carry a bier, and heard the coffin knock against the churchyard gate, going in? Faith, sir, I've, faith? What's that? Why, faith, sir, it's only a sort of exclamation like, that's all, sir. Go on. I was about to say, sir, that, art thou a silkworm? Dost thou spin thy own shroud out of thyself? Look at thy bosom. Dispatch. And get these traps out of sight. He goes aft. That was sudden, now, but squalls come sudden in hot latitudes. I've heard that the Isle of Albemarle, one of the Galapagos, is cut by the equator right in the middle. Seems to me some sort of equator cuts yon old man, too, right in his middle. He's always under the line, fiery hot, I tell ye. He's looking this way, come, Wickham, quick. Here we go again. This wooden mallet is the cork, and I'm the professor of musical glasses, tap, tap. Ahab to himself, there's a sight. There's a sound. The grated woodpecker tapping the hollow tree. Blind and dumb might well be envied now. See. That thing rests on 2 line tubs, full of tow lines. A most malicious wag, that fellow. Rat-tat. So man's seconds are dick. Oh. How immaterial are all materials. What things real are there, but, imponderable thoughts? Here now's the very dreaded symbol of grim death, by a mere hap, made the expressive sign of the help and hope of most endangered life. A life buoy of a coffin. Does it go further? Can it be that in some spiritual sense the coffin is, after all, but an immortality preserver? I'll think of that. But no. So far gone am I in the dark side of earth, that its other side, the theoretic bright one, seems but uncertain twilight to me. Will ye never have done, carpenter, with that accursed sound? I go below, let me not see that thing here when I return again. Now, then, Pip, we'll talk this over. I do suck most wondrous philosophies from thee. Some unknown conduits from the unknown worlds must empty into thee. Chapter 128. The Pequod meets the Rachel. Next day, a large ship, the Rachel, was descried, bearing directly down upon the Pequod, all her spars thickly clustering with men. At the time the Pequod was making good speed through the water, but as the board went windward stranger shot nigh to her, the boastful sails all fell together as blank bladders that are burst, and all life fled from the smitten hull. Bad news, she brings bad news, muttered the old Manxman. But ere her commander, who, with trumpet to mouth, stood up in his boat, ere he could hopefully hail, Ahab's voice was heard. Hast seen the white whale? Aye, yesterday. Have ye seen a whaleboat adrift? Throttling his joy, Ahab negatively answered this unexpected question, and would then have fain boarded the stranger, when the stranger captain himself, having stopped his vessel's way, was seen descending her side. A few keen pulls, and his boat hook soon clinched the Pequod's main chains, and he sprang to the deck. Immediately he was recognized by Ahab for a Nantucketer he knew. But no formal salutation was exchanged. Where was he? Not killed! Not killed! Cried Ahab, closely advancing. How was it? It seemed that somewhat late on the afternoon of the day previous, while 3 of the strangers' boats were engaged with a shoal of whales, which had led them some 4 or 5 miles from the ship, and while they were yet in swift chase to windward, the white hump and head of Moby Dick had suddenly loomed up out of the water, not very far to leeward, whereupon, the fourth-rigged boat, a reserved one, had been instantly lowered in chase. After a keen sail before the wind, this fourth boat, the swiftest keeled of all, seemed to have succeeded in fastening, at least, as well as the man at the masthead could tell anything about it. In the distance he saw the diminished dotted boat, and then a swift gleam of bubbling white water, and after that nothing more, whence it was concluded that the stricken whale must have indefinitely run away with his pursuers, as often happens. There was some apprehension, but no positive alarm, as yet. The recall signals were placed in the rigging, darkness came on, and forced to pick up her 3 far to windward boats, ere going in quest of the fourth one in the precisely opposite direction. The ship had not only been necessitated to leave that boat to its fate till near midnight, but, for the time, to increase her distance from it. But the rest of her crew being at last safe aboard, she crowded all sail, stunsail on stunsail, after the missing boat, kindling a fire in her trypots for a beacon, and every other man aloft on the lookout. But though when she had thus sailed a sufficient distance to gain the presumed place of the absent ones when last seen, though she then paused to lower her spare boats to pull all around her, and not finding anything, had again dashed on, again paused, and lowered her boats, and though she had thus continued doing till daylight, yet not the least glimpse of the missing keel had been seen. The story told, the stranger captain immediately went on to reveal his object in boarding the Pequod. He desired that ship to unite with his own in the search, by sailing over the sea some 4 or 5 miles apart, on parallel lines, and so sweeping a double horizon, as it were. "I will wager something now," whispered Stubb to Flask, "that someone in that missing boat wore off that captain's best coat, mayhap, his watch. He's so cursed anxious to get it back. Whoever heard of 2 pious whale ships cruising after one missing whaleboat in the height of the whaling season? See, Flask, only see how pale he looks, pale in the very buttons of his eyes. Look, it wasn't the coat, it must have been my boy, my own boy is among them. For God's sake, I beg, I conjure here," exclaimed the stranger captain to Ahab, who thus far had but icily received his petition. "For 8 and 40 hours let me charter your ship, I will gladly pay for it, and roundly pay for it, if there be no other way, for 8 and 40 hours only that, you must, oh, you must, and you shall do this thing." "His son!" cried Stubb. "Oh, it's his son he's lost. I take back the coat and watch. What says Ahab? We must save that boy. He's drowned with the rest on him, last night," said the old Manx sailor standing behind them. "I heard, all of ye heard their spirits." Now, as it shortly turned out, what made this incident of the Rachels the more melancholy, was the circumstance, that not only was one of the captain's sons among the number of the missing boat's crew, but among the number of the other boat's crews, at the same time, but on the other hand, separated from the ship during the dark vicissitudes of the chase, there had been still another son, as that for a time, the wretched father was plunged to the bottom of the cruelest perplexity, which was only solved for him by his chief mate's instinctively adopting the ordinary procedure of a whale ship in such emergencies, that is, when placed between jeopardized but divided boats, always to pick up the majority first. But the captain, for some unknown constitutional reason, had refrained from mentioning all this, and not till forced to it by Ahab's iciness did he allude to his one yet missing boy, a little lad, but 12 years old, whose father with the earnest but ungiving hardihood of a Nantucketer's paternal love, had thus early sought to initiate him in the perils and wonders of a vocation almost immemorially the destiny of all his race. Nor does it unfrequently occur, that Nantucket captains will send a son of such tender age away from them, for a protracted 3 or 4 years' voyage in some other ship than their own, so that their first knowledge of the whaleman's career shall be uninnervated by any chance display of a father's natural but untimely partiality, or undue apprehensiveness and concern. Meantime, now the stranger was still beseeching his poor boon of Ahab, and Ahab still stood like an anvil, receiving every shock, but without the least quivering of his own. "I will not go," said the stranger, "till you say aye to me." Do to me as you would have me do to you in the like case. For you too have a boy, Captain Ahab, though but a child, and nestling safely at home now, a child of your old age too. Yes, yes, you relent, I see it. Run, run, men, now, and stand by to square inches the yards. Avast, cried Ahab, touch not a rope yarn. Then in a voice that prolongingly molded every word, Captain Gardner, I will not do it. Even now I lose time. Goodbye, goodbye. God bless ye, man, and may I forgive myself, but I must go. Mr. Starbuck, look at the binnacle watch, and in 3 minutes from this present instant warn off all strangers, then brace forward again, and let the ship sail as before. Hurriedly turning, with averted face, he descended into his cabin, leaving the strange captain transfixed at this unconditional and utter rejection of his so earnest suit. But starting from his enchantment, Gardner silently hurried to the side, more fell than stepped into his boat, and returned to his ship. Soon the two ships diverged their wakes, and long as the strange vessel was in view, she was seen to yaw hither and thither at every dark spot, however small, on the sea. This way and that her yards were swung round, starboard and larboard, she continued to tack. Now she beat against a head sea, and again it pushed her before it, while all the while, her masts and yards were thickly clustered with men, as 3 tall cherry trees, when the boys are cherrying among the boughs. But by her still halting course and winding, woeful way, you plainly saw that this ship that so wept with spray, still remained without comfort. She was Rachel, weeping for her children, because they were not. Chapter 129. The cabin. Ahab moving to go on deck, Pip catches him by the hand to follow. Lad, lad, I tell thee thou must not follow Ahab now. The hour is coming when Ahab would not scare thee from him, yet would not have thee by him. There is that in thee, poor lad, which I feel too curing to my malady. Like cures like, and for this hunt, my malady becomes my most desired health. Do thou bide below here, where they shall serve thee, as if thou wert the captain. I, lad, thou shalt sit here in my own screw chair, another screw to it, thou must be. No, no, no. Ye have not a whole body, sir, do ye but use poor me for your one lost leg, only tread upon me, sir, I ask no more, so I remain a part of ye. Oh! Spite of million villains, this makes me a bigot in the fadeless fidelity of man and a black and crazy but methinks like cures like applies to him too, he grows so sane again. They tell me, sir, that Stubb did once desert poor little Pip, whose drowned bones now show white, for all the blackness of his living skin. But I will never desert ye, sir, as Stubb did him. Sir, I must go with ye. If thou speakest thus to me much more, Ahab's purpose keels up in him. I tell thee no, it cannot be. O good master, master, master. Weep so, and I will murder thee. Have a care, for Ahab too is mad. Listen, and thou wilt often hear my ivory foot upon the deck, and still know that I am there. And now I quit thee. Thy hand met. True art thou, lad, as the circumference to its center. So, God forever bless thee, and if it come to that, God forever save thee, let what will befall. Ahab goes, Pip steps one step forward, here he this instant stood, I stand in his air, but I am alone. Now were even poor Pip here I could endure it, but he's missing. Pip. Pip. Ding, dong, ding. Who's seen Pip? He must be up here. Let's try the door. What? Neither lock, nor bolt, nor bar, and yet there's no opening it. It must be the spell. He told me to stay here, and told me this screw chair was mine. Here, then, I'll seat me, against the transom, in the ship's full middle, all her keel and her 3 masts before me. Here, our old sailors say, in their black 74s great admirals sometimes sit at table, and lord it over rows of captains and lieutenants. Ha! What's this? Epaulets. Epaulets. The epaulets all come crowding. pass round the decanters, glad to see ye, fill up, messieurs. What an odd feeling, now, when a black boy's host to white men with gold lace upon their coats ! Messieurs, have ye seen one pip ? A little negro lad, 5 feet high, hangdog look, and cowardly. Jumped from a whaleboat once ? Seen him? No. Well then, fill up again, captains, and let's drink shame upon all cowards. I name no names. Shame upon them. Put one foot upon the table. Shame upon all cowards. Hist. Above there, I hear ivory. Oh, master. Master. I am indeed downhearted when you walk over me. But here I'll stay, though the stern strikes rocks, and they bulge through, and oysters come to join me. Chapter 130. The Hat. And now that at the proper time and place, after so long and wide a preliminary cruise, Ahab, all other wailing waters swept, seemed to have chased his foe into an ocean fold, to slay him the more securely there, now, that he found himself hard by the very latitude and longitude where his tormenting wound had been inflicted, now that a vessel had been spoken which on the very day preceding had actually encountered Moby Dick, and now that all his successive meetings with various ships contrastingly concurred to show the demoniac indifference with which the white whale tore his hunters, whether sinning or sinned against, now it was that there lurked a something in the old man's eyes, which it was hardly sufferable for feeble souls to see. As the unsetting polar star, which through the livelong, Arctic, 6 months night sustains its piercing, steady, cinderal gaze, so Ahab's purpose now fixedly gleamed down upon the constant midnight of the gloomy crew. It domineered above them so, that all their bodings, doubts, misgivings, fears, were fain to hide beneath their souls, and not sprout forth a single spear or leaf. In this foreshadowing interval too, all humor, forced or natural, vanished. Stubb no more strove to raise a smile, Starbuck no more strove to check one. Alike, joy and sorrow, hope and fear, seemed ground to finest dust, and powdered, for the time, in the clamped mortar of Ahab's iron soul. Like machines, they dumbly moved about the deck, ever conscious that the old man's desperate eye was on them. But did you deeply scan him in his more secret, confidential hours, when he thought no glance but one was on him, then you would have seen that even as Ahab's eyes so awed the crews, the inscrutable Parsee's glance awed his, or somehow, at least, in some wild way, at times affected it. Such an added, gliding strangeness began to invest the thin fiedler now, such ceaseless shudderings shook him, that the men looked dubious at him, half, uncertain, as it seemed, whether indeed he were immortal substance, or else a tremulous shadow cast upon the deck by some unseen being's body. And that shadow was always hovering there. For not by night, even, had Fiedler ever certainly been known to slumber, or go below. He would stand still for hours, but never sat or leaned, his wan but wondrous eyes did plainly say, we two watchmen never rest, nor, at any time, by night or day could the mariners now step upon the deck, unless Ahab was before them, either standing in his pivot hole, or exactly pacing the planks between two undeviating limits, the mainmast and the mizzen, or else they saw him standing in the cabin scuttle, his living foot advanced upon the deck, as if to step, his hat slouched heavily over his eyes, so that however motionless he stood, however the days and nights were added on, that he had not swung in his hammock, yet hidden beneath that slouching hat, they could never tell unerringly whether, for all this, his eyes were really closed at times, or whether he was still intently scanning them. No matter, though he stood so in the scuttle for a whole hour on the stretch, and the unheated night damp gathered in, beads of dew upon that stone-carved coat and hat. The clothes that the night had wet, the next day's sunshine dried upon him, and so, day after day, and night after night, he went no more beneath the planks. Whatever he wanted from the cabin, that thing he sent for. He ate in the same open air, that is, his two only meals, breakfast and dinner. Supper he never touched, nor reaped his beard, which, darkly grew all gnarled, as unearthed roots of trees blown over, which still grow idly on its naked base, though perished in the upper verdure. But though his whole life was now become one watch on deck, and though the Parsee's mystic watch was without intermission as his own, yet these two never seemed to speak, one man to the other, unless at long intervals some passing and momentous matter made it necessary. Though such a potent spell seemed secretly to join the twain, openly, and to the awestruck crew, they seemed polite asunder. If by day they chanced to speak one word, by night, dumb men were both, so far as concerned the slightest verbal interchange. At times, for longest hours, without a single hail, they stood far parted in the starlight, Ahab in his scuttle, the Parsee by the mainmast, but still fixedly gazing upon each other, as if in the Parsee Ahab saw his forethrown shadow, in Ahab the Parsee his abandoned substance. And yet, somehow, did Ahab, in his own proper self, as daily, hourly, and every instant, commandingly revealed to his subordinates, Ahab seemed an independent lord, the Parsee but his slave. Still again both seem yoked together, and an unseen tyrant, driving them, the lean shade siding the solid rib. For be this Parsee what he may, all rib and keel was solid Ahab. At the first faintest glimmering of the dawn, his iron voice was heard from aft, "Man the mastheads!" And all through the day, till after sunset and after twilight, the same voice every hour, at the striking of the helmsman's bell, was heard, "What do ye see?" Sharp. Sharp. But when, 3 or 4 days had slided by, after meeting the children seeking Rachel, and no spout had yet been seen, the monomaniac old man seemed distrustful of his crew's fidelity, at least, of nearly all except the pagan harpooneers. He seemed to doubt, even, whether Stubb and Flask might not willingly overlook the sight he sought. But if these suspicions were really his, he sagaciously refrained from verbally expressing them, however his actions might seem to hint them. "I will have the first sight of the whale myself," he said. Ahab must have the doubloon. And with his own hands he rigged a nest of basketed bowlines, and sending a hand aloft, with a single sheaved block, to secure to the mainmast head, he received the 2 ends of the downward reeved rope, and attaching one to his basket prepared a pin for the other end, in order to fasten it at the rail. This done, with that end yet in his hand and standing beside the pin, he looked round upon his crew, sweeping from one to the other, pausing his glance long upon Daggoo, Gweegig, Tashko, but shunning Fiedla, and then settling his firm relying eye upon the chief mate, said, "Take the rope, sir, I give it into thy hands, Starbuck." Then arranging his person in the basket, he gave the word for them to hoist him to his perch, Starbuck being the one who secured the rope at last, and afterwards stood near it. And thus, with one hand clinging round the royal mast, Ahab gazed abroad upon the sea for miles and miles ahead, astern, this side, and that within the wide expanded circle commanded at so great a height. When, in working with his hands at some lofty almost isolated place in the rigging, which chances to afford no foothold, the sailor at sea is hoisted up to that spot, and sustained there by the rope, under these circumstances, its fastened end on deck is always given in strict charge to some one man who has a special watch of it. Because in such a wilderness of running rigging, whose various different relations aloft cannot always be infallibly discerned by what is seen of them at the deck, and when the deck ends of these ropes are being every few minutes cast down from the fastenings, it would be but a natural fatality, if, unprovided with a constant watchman, the hoisted sailor should by some carelessness of the crew be cast adrift and fall all swooping to the sea. So Ahab's proceedings in this matter were not unusual. The only strange thing about them seemed to be, that Starbuck, almost the one only man who had ever ventured to oppose him with anything in the slightest degree approaching to decision, one of those two, whose faithfulness on the lookout he had seemed to doubt somewhat. It was strange, that this was the very man he should select for his watchman, freely giving his whole life into such an otherwise distrusted person's hands. Now, the first time Ahab was perched aloft, ere he had been there 10 minutes, one of those red-billed savage sea hawks which so often fly incommodiously close round the man-mastheads of whalemen in these latitudes, one of these birds came wheeling and screaming round his head in a maze of untrackably swift circlings. Then it darted, 1,000 feet straight up into the air, then spiralized downwards, and went eddying again round his head. But with his gaze fixed upon the dim and distant horizon, Ahab seemed not to mark this wild bird, nor, indeed, would anyone else have marked it much, it being no uncommon circumstance, only now almost the least heedful eye seemed to see some sort of cunning meaning in almost every sight. Your hat, sir!" suddenly cried the Sicilian seaman, who being posted at the mizzen masthead, stood directly behind Ahab, though somewhat lower than his level, and with a deep gulf of air dividing them. But already the sable wing was before the old man's eyes, the long hooked bill at his head. With a scream, the black hawk darted away with his prize. An eagle flew thrice round Tarquin's head, removing his cap to replace it, and thereupon Tanaquil, his wife, declared that Tarquin would be king of Rome. But only by the replacing of the cap was that omen accounted good. Ahab's hat was never restored, the wild hawk flew on and on with it, far in advance of the prow, and at last disappeared, while from the point of that disappearance, a minute black spot was dimly discerned, falling, from that vast height into the sea.